Kia ora and welcome to the Niggly Niche Cast. It's your boy, the Diggity Doodad Dog, Mr. Papatoe Panther, here with the Wobbly Wildcard to chat our way through some Kiwi sporting topics and a little bit of international flavour on this episode as well. We've got a Dan Hooker's UFC loss to Dustin Poirier. We've got the NBL just flowing on. We've got our flying Kiwis doing their thing around the world, as well as Liverpool winning the old Premiership. And then we'll finish with a little look back at the weekend of NRL footy and wildcard. I'll tease that by saying I've got a couple of bits and bobs about some former players, some former Warriors players who are actually doing a lot better now that they are no longer with the Warriors. So that's pretty interesting, I believe. The best way to support the Niche Case is on Patreon. So jump on Patreon, support us straight up the guts if you do like what we're doing. Otherwise, every Monday and Friday, we serve up a fresh email banger coming straight to your inbox with a few bits and bobs that just come to us freely. We express ourselves and dive into topics that we otherwise don't. So jump on the email. It's good. It's twice a week. And little bonus bits and pieces. Wobbly Wildcard. What's crack-a-lackin'?
Yeah, man, not a whole lot. Little bit short on sleep after a long weekend with a fair bit of driving involved. But I remember last week I had the old. Do you remember when my little meditation app popped up with a quote right in like the time we were recording, and you said bottle up a few of those for next time. Well, today's one was some rando called John Thornton who said meditation is to the mind what exercise is to the body. It warms and invigorates. So there's your wisdom to start off your I was going to say start off the week because it feels like a Monday to me because I was driving all day yesterday, but I don't know. Days of the week are all the same, really. They all end in Y.
It's a fantastic quote, and I actually forgot about that, so glad. Thank you for reminding me, and we start that. And we start with a little bit of gratitude. Just thankful for our existence here and the fact that we can do a podcast. I would add that exercise probably warms the mind as well. Exercise is good for the mind completely. And gets the brain oxygenated and all that stuff. So I don't mean to... Yeah, I'm definitely not poo-pooing your little quotes there. I'm more adding to
Johnny
it.
Thornton.
We're adding to it. We're enhancing the meditation quotes wildcard. Ooh. Dan Hook had a tough loss on Sunday over in Las Vegas, and I've seen Dan Hooker take some absolute beatings now. That's one of my low-key takeaway from that fight wildcard is seeing Dan Hooker go into this weird zombie mode where, let me take you on a little journey here. So a couple fights back against Edson Barboza, which was a 3-round fight, I believe. Dan Hooker got finished in the 3rd, but he just took a absolute beating from Barboza, and he has this like mode where everything kind of goes out the window in terms of game plan, in terms of precision, and just a full like slickness. All of that goes out the window, and Dan Hooker just stands in front of his opponent. Zero expression of pain or joy, just complete zombie mode, and he just takes punishment. And that happened a couple of fights back, maybe 2018, I think it was. And then he had a couple of wins, and then he had the Paul Felder fight, which was a 5-round war. A little bit of zombie mode there. And then against Dustin Poirier, another 5-round war. Many people thought it was the second best fight of the year. There was a fight earlier this year prior to the lockdown with Zhang Wei Li and Joanna Jędrzejczyk, who are both female fighters. They put on an absolute extravaganza. That was fight of the year. Everyone still thinks that's fight of the year. Dustin Poirier and Dan Hooker like second so far this year. So it was a 5-round war. And kudos to Dan Hooker. Like, he can do what most of us mere mortals can't do in taking an absolute beating whilst in zombie mode. But I just have this feeling it's not good for him. He's done it a few times now. And I'll get into like how he lost to Dustin Poirier and why he lost to Dustin Poirier. But wildcard, just seeing someone Like, the fact that he can go into zombie mode and just stand there in the pocket in front of someone, taking their hardest shots and firing a few of his own shots off. But yeah, the fact that he can do that is amazing, but it's not good. And it's not good for longevity. And I'm just thinking about this because Dan Hooker's had a few of those in the last few years. So 5-round war, long term, not the best.
Yeah, zombie mode, eh? I wasn't home to watch any of the fights, so I haven't caught up on that yet, but I did see a photo of his face after the fight, and I know that's kind of like a common thing in combat sports, is like show all the bruises and the puffed eyes and whatever, and the stitches and things like that, and even if you win, you can like, it doesn't necessarily mean you got whooped up, it just means you're in a tough fight, but didn't look, I wouldn't say he was quite at like his prom night best or anything like that. It looked pretty painful.
Dustin Poirier's face was kind of brutalized as well. So
yeah. Well, it's one of those like, you should see the other guy once, is what they always say. Eh?
Well, it's a genuine Fight of the Year candidate. So when that's thrown around, it's not because one dude beat the shit out of another dude, or one woman beat the shit out of one woman. It's where both fighters are going toe for toe and putting on a show in the most brutal fashion. So I would hope that Dan Hooker, it's a balance, because you want to be busy and you want to kind of ride a wave of momentum. But I think for Dan Hooker now, as I assess the lightweight division and I think about Dan Hooker's last kind of 2 years, the best thing for Dan Hooker is probably take a little bit of time off and maybe one fight in the second half for 2020. All good if there's no more fights for Dan Hooker in 2020, in part because it's the lightweight division has to sort itself out. So next up you've got Khabib versus Justin Gaethje. So that's going to happen sometime soon. I don't know the exact date, but that's the title shot. Tony Ferguson's looking for a fight. He's just come off a loss to Justin Gaethje. And so the best thing, one of the best matchups you could do right now is Dustin Poirier versus Tony Ferguson, who are two of the top five. And then you got two of the top five also in that title fight. That leaves Dan Hooker like surplus for a while. He could go back and fight someone like Paul Felder again. But the best thing for Dan Hooker, I reckon, is just to wait and let the dust settle on this division. Let the title fight happen. Let Ferguson fight Dustin Poirier possibly. And then just see who emerges from the next few fights. Like who loses, probably is the best way to put it. Who loses, who drops down to the bracket where Dan Hooker is. Because I think the fight and the loss against Dustin Poirier showed that there's a bit of a gap between the straight up like best of the lightweight division and then, you know, the guys ranked 5, 6, 7, 8. And I think Dan Hooker got introduced to the top tier of the lightweight division in that fight against Dustin Poirier. And I think there's a few areas of Dan Hooker's fighting game that could be improved for another fight in the top tier of that lightweight division. So as far as like tactics and stylistically go, Dan Hooker started the fight against Dustin Poirier with some great leg kicks, and I had highlighted, I think it was in the email newsletter on Friday, that Dan Hooker round 1 and 2, Dan Hooker loves to kick. And that sets up the distance control, it sets up the range, it sets up traps as well, because when there's a kick, it's usually followed by a punching combination, an elbow, knee, movement, whatever it is. But the kick sets up movement, it sets up traps, it sets up fakes and feints. And Dan Hooker was per script or per trend as far as early kicks go. And that worked because Dan Hooker won the first 2 rounds of the fight. So Dan Hooker's kicks set up a lot of the punching combinations, as well as doing damage to Dustin Poirier's front leg. I think it was his right calf muscle maybe, which was being targeted. Dan Hooker did all that. But the reason I'm not so fond of zombie mode for Dan Hooker. As admirable as it is, as mana-filled as it is, Dan Hooker just went straight into the pocket of trading blows with Dustin Poirier. Now, Dustin Poirier is one of the hardest hitters in this division, but he's also got experience of fighting the best fighters in this division. He's got far more experience at the top of the lightweight division than Dan Hooker. So, I reckon if Dan Hooker could do a bit more distance control in the third round and stay on the outside of Poirier, keep kicking the leg, keep touching up with the punching combinations, mix it in with takedowns, and just stay precision, stay classy, stay in control of the fight, I think he definitely could have won the fight. But Poirier kind of landed the heavier shots early, I reckon, and that put Dan Hooker in the zombie mode. So then zombie mode Dan Hooker just comes out and he's just standing in front of Dustin Poirier, eating some of the heaviest shots that any lightweight is going to throw. And that's why Dan Hooker lost. He was winning the first 2 rounds. Great job. And then he kind of fell away from the tactics and the game plan, and it just turned into a war. Dustin Poirier is far more experienced in those deep waters, as they call it. And that's how Poirier got the win. So against Paul Felder, Dan Hooker had a takedown late in the 5th round, which many people believed swung the fight in favor of Dan Hooker. It was a close fight, fairly even throughout the whole fight. And then Dan Hooker gets a takedown late in the fight, which there's discussion and controversy over whether a takedown can swing the judges, or how you get points for a takedown and stuff like that. But ultimately, a late takedown resulted in Dan Hooker getting the win over Paul Felder. This fight, Dan Hooker was doing some takedowns in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th round, but then from the bottom, Dustin Poirier was doing a whole lot of submission attempts. He was going for triangles and all these different little submission attempts that generate fatigue in him, but also his opponent, because he has to get out of them. And then even from the bottom, Poirier was so imagine I think they call it full guard. My jiu-jitsu and stuff isn't so flash, but you're in half guard or full guard, which means you're basically sitting on top of your opponent. But imagine this wild card. You're face down looking at your opponent, and they're elbowing you in the face from the bottom. And that's what Poirier was doing. So it's even Dan Hooker taking down Poirier numerous times, all those takedowns didn't really go in favor of Dan Hooker, because Poirier was doing heaps of damage from the bottom, and he was also niggling away with all sorts of different little submission attempts. So it was a war on the feet. Dan Hooker stood in the pocket and absorbed a whole lot of damage. When Dan Hooker tried to take him down, Poirier still did damage and was still kind of in control of the fight. So there was a little gap in quality and class, but that's due to experience. And I think ultimately Dan Hooker's stocks go up in defeat.
Well, that's the thing, about the fight of the year type candidate fights, is even if you lose those ones, ultimately the fight game is an entertainment game. That's where, as you say that about all sports, it's as long as you can sell broadcast packages and bring fans into stadiums and stuff, asterisk on that last one in this current time. That's the kind of the essence, the essence of it. And if you even if you do lose those kind of crazy wild, everybody loves this one kind of fight that people continue to talk about months down the line, so it's one of the top fights of the year kind of thing. Even if you lose that, at least your reputation goes up anyway, because A, it was competitive and that's the kind of thing people want to see, and then B, just having they don't say the Dustin Poirier fight was one of the top fights of the year. They say the Poirier Hooker fight was one of the you're already in that kind of your name's on the marquee because of that. You could think of a lot of people who fought Muhammad Ali over the years, who had that kind of name recognition specifically because they fought Muhammad Ali over the years, that kind of thing. So like your stocks go up, yeah, regardless anyway. But even more so with what you're saying, I guess if he can like close that gap, just learning from the experience and tidying up a few things and maybe not going full zombie mode, then yeah, like it's not the kind of result that does any damage to your long-term prospects, is it?
Not at all, unless you've had like 2 or 3 fights similar. Then the physical element of being in a fight of the year, I am interested in how that impacts or influences Dan Hooker moving forward, because a lot of good like MMA judges, they say when you're in such a fight, like you maybe even every fight, but when you're in a fight of that quality and of that brutality, you leave a bit of yourself in the octagon. And if you have too many of those fights, think about how much of your soul, of your mana, or like of your just energy, your fighting energy, you're leaving in the octagon. And that's where I just wonder about Dan Hooker moving forward. But if there's anything about City Kickboxing, very astute in looking after their fighters, as well as very astute with their tactics and strategies and that stuff. So I would not be surprised if Eugene Behrman and City Kickboxing just told Dan Hooker to chill out for a bit and move forward from there. And just on City Kickboxing, there is, I think Joe Rogan said it on a recent podcast, so there's been a bit of buzz around it, but it's not official. Israel Adesanya may be coaching on the upcoming season of The Ultimate Fighter, which is basically like a UFC reality show. Do you remember the Contender Series wildcard? Or the Contender, the boxing one?
Yeah, I do remember that.
Yeah, so it's a bit like that. Obviously, the Ultimate Fighter, for those interested in the UFC and MMA, has been around for ages. But yeah, it's basically based off the Contender, and now I've just got some memories of watching that old Contender stuff floating through my mind. So Adesanya may be a coach on that again with Paulo Costa, who is likely to be his next opponent, and they each, like leading up to the fight, they have this Ultimate Fighter series. They are both coaches, and they have their own teams of fighters who fight against each other, and it sets up the eventual fight between Adesanya and Costa. That's kind of their script and routine for it. Just on that, it would be amazing for Israel Adesanya, because Israel Adesanya has a fantastic personality. We've seen recently in Aotearoa how much of a leader he is as well, but just the personality and vibrancy, who he is, all of that stuff will be broadcast far more, like with far more clarity and to far more people. So I think that could blow up Israel Adesanya even more than what we've seen before. Like everyone's seen him dance as his walkout. But now, if he is on The Ultimate Fighter, people are going to see him far more of his personality on a day-to-day, episode-to-episode basis, who he is as a person, and he'll absolutely destroy Costa as far as like shit-talking goes. So if Israel Adesanya is to be a coach on The Ultimate Fighter, that would be epic, and I think that would be very good as well.